Welcome to Neon Cobra. Let's kick into it. Great. This week is going to be week 2 of what I'm labeling my common estimate browsers. So what we're going to do is we're going to actually piggyback off of last week's video. So I'm going to show you that link in the comments below if you want to get quick access to it. But we're going to do a little bit more of a robust or a larger version of the QuickBooks deployment. So the concept we're going to be looking at this time is essentially an environment that maybe has more than 5 users, maybe has some other underlying applications, and we want to be able to scale, right? So we need additional feature sets. We need role-based access control. So what we're going to do is we're going to hop over to the pricing calculator like we did before, but I'm not going to reinvent everything we just did. So if you would have followed in the first video, I would have told you to make sure you're logging in and saving your quotes. Because what we're going to do is go over to save estimates. We will see the previous one we built. We are going to copy this, which will create this copy here, and we're going to open that up. So even though I'm in an incognito window, you're going to find that this information is saved and updated as needed. So we're going to change this QuickBooks build. We're going to change the title, and we're going to say 25 users, right? Let's talk about an organization that maybe uses this more proactively, much larger, but they still have general line of business. One of the additional items we're going to probably add to this is its own dedicated storage, right? We're going to be upgrading things and providing more flexibility to the environment. So when we look at what we had just quickly, we had a single server that was acting as an AVD host. We had a QuickBooks data disk attached to it. We had a NAT gateway. We had accounted for the backups of that data and then the bandwidth out. So some of the first changes we are going to do is we're going to add a domain controller. So having a domain controller in this particular scenario grants us role-based access control, which allows us to then join the servers to the domains and as well as leverage features like FS logics. So we are going to be making some changes to this quote. But first things first, start with our center pillar, domain controller. So instead of going up and choosing virtual machines, we're going to come and choose under QuickBooks Server. We're going to clone that box. That's going to maintain the regions, all the terms and conditions. And I'm just going to rename this domain controller. Right? Now, everything will stay the same, but we do want to change the instance type, right? In this case, it is not that heavy of a lift, right? A domain controller is pretty light, doesn't require too much. So what I'm going to choose for this is a B series. Now, you would have likely seen in previous videos, B series are burstable machines, right? They have limitations around their CPU, but they're available to burst well beyond as long as there are credits available. And you gain credits by not using the system, or rather low peak times, right? So what you'll find is a domain controller will sit around and really not do too much until, say, people start logging in or general requests happen from the DC, which is very few and far between. So then after hours, it can spend time just gathering credits. So a 2-core, 8 gig system or B2MS is a perfect system to run domain controllers for, we'll say, up to about 50 users. Anything beyond 50, you may want to go to a B4MS just in case. But even then, you could likely get away with B2 depending on the services you're running on it. Now, one of the biggest changes and the reason why we choose B series is we're going to want to actually do license included for the operating system. So if this was any other series like a D or an E, you'd be looking at almost $80 a month, right? The reason why we always align with B series for low CPU infrequent workloads or burstable workloads is that the cost for the operating system is much, much cheaper. So then you can save money by not having to buy licensing up front. We'll come down and we'll edit our disks. We don't need anything crazy for this. So we'll do a 128 standard SSD. And for $57 a month, we have our domain controller. Now, I do like to rearrange these personally. I'd like to start with our primary servers at the top. So I'll toss that up there. Now, the next change I'm going to make is to this QuickBooks server. So because we are now talking about 25 users, I'm going to turn this QuickBooks server into an application server, right? It is no longer going to be the AVD host. This is going to be purely a host for any sort of applications and files. So I am going to open this up and just quickly rename this app server just for clarity. All right. Now, we probably don't need a 4-core 32 anymore, right? There's not going to be user profiles on here. So maybe we do a D4S, right? This is going to shrink down the memory allocation, but still maintain the core ratios. Now, even then, depending on what's being used, you could probably go down to a 2-core. but then we start to have to concern ourselves with potential IO throughput and network traffic, right? If you have a lot of users accessing a very small server, you may get constraints in other areas. So for safety's sake, a 4-core 16, we're still going to buy the licensing ahead of time. We're going to make sure the disks is appropriate. Now, again, because this is now going down to a standard server, we're going to be running our server operating systems. Users will not be directly interfacing with the operating system disk. User drives are not present here anymore. So we're going to shrink that down, which is going to greatly reduce the cost to about 93. Now, managed disks in this case was the QB data. We're going to call this file/QB. We're going to assume at this point they've got more information to work with, right? They've got PDFs. Potentially this is an accounting firm, so maybe they've got a bunch of different QuickBooks folders and files for their client base. So we're going to give this a little bit more space. Right, we're going to jump this up to a 512. The assumption is they're hosting QuickBooks files for all of their clients, and the accountants hop in and hop out. This is a really common build for accounting firms. You may find things like tax prep and all these extra items also live on the QB or the app server, which is why I've labeled it that. And you can just host that data on there. Now, the biggest change we're going to have to make is now we're going to have to add a virtual desktop. And I'm going to do it with the actual virtual desktop SKU. So if you recall in the first video, I talked about how really a virtual machine can act as a virtual desktop as far as a pricing exercise. But when you start getting into the actual AVD SKU itself, there's a lot of extra questions you have to navigate through. So we're going to go cover that right now. So remember, we set our region, in this case, Canada Central. Don't worry about the price because it starts by sizing it off at 500 users. Your first decision is whether you want multi-session or single session. 99% of the time, I'll say you will want multi-session, right? This is an economies of scale play. This is the ability to put numerous users on a single host as opposed to giving everyone their own personalized desktop. Now, instances where you may need to do personalized desktoping could be anyone, maybe a power user that takes a lot of resources, so you want to contain them on their own, right? But still provide them a Windows 11 desktop. Anyone that maybe requires local admin rights, right? You want to try to avoid that as much as possible. But realistically, there are just some legacy apps out there that just don't play nice, right? And you don't want to give everyone multi-session, on a multi-session, local administrator access. They could shut the whole system down. They could purge things. So we don't want to do that. You want to containerize. In this case, we're going to choose multi-session. We then get to choose workload type. Now, this is purely just to dictate CPU ratio, right? How many users per core is allocated. And when we choose our virtual machines below, that's how it gets to the amount of VMs we want. Now, the one complaint I have with this is it's very restricting, right? I generally like to put for, moderate workloads like this, 10 users per session host, right? I've got kind of an equation that tends to work, and I'd say it serves about 80% of the time, right? And that's about 10 users per 8-core 64 gigs or an E8S. Now, the problem is we can't do that. The ratio is 1.3, right? So the closest we can do is a heavy user, right? So sometimes we have to fudge the numbers here, and I'll show you what we do for that. So now we choose our scaling options or constant availability. This is really whether you want to keep it on 24/7 or scale it up and down. If you're using plans like Nerdio Manager for MSP, you can, you'd be pricing in their calculator, but that would take into account scaling. For this case, we're going to just do plain Jane, 25 users. We're going to say we're scaling just so I can show you, but when we actually get down to the bottom, we're going to lock it in with reserved instances. So we'll do 220 hours per month, right? So that's about a 60-hour work week on 4 weeks. So this would be a little bit of a bloated deployment. Sorry, 50-hour work weeks, 55. I'm here for Azure, not for math. 55-hour work weeks, which is pricing on the high side, which is not a bad idea, right? Because even though their work week may be 40 hours, you may have someone burning midnight oil, right? They log in at 7, 8 o'clock, and even if it's one user, keeps that host online. External pricing. This is if you're creating AVD hosts for users outside of your domain. It changes the entire pricing model to a cost per user. This is good if you're serving up an application and you don't want to have to buy business premium licensing for every random contractor or something that comes in. You can provide them per user per month pricing. Requires an entire subscription dedicated to that. If you're also using AVD internally, it changes the subscription pricing model, not just the AVD host pool at this time. Now we get down and we see our virtual machine types. So as mentioned, I like the E8S, 8 CPU, 64 gigs. Now, what you're going to see is it's going to say off-peak concurrency. Essentially, this is outside of business hours, one host will be online. And then during peak concurrency, as in everyone's logged in for 220 hours, we have two. Now, the problem with this, and as I mentioned above, I like to have 3 hosts or 10 users per host. So with 25 users, I would want 3 hosts at peak, right? And depending on how you scale and you design that, that would actually load balance and probably put around 8 people per host, which is a nice, area for growth. So to get this number to where I want it to be, I have a choice. I can come back up here. I can play with the heavy user work type, maybe move it to medium. But if I move it to medium, it's going to go down to 1. If I move it up to power user, it's going to bring me up to 4. So I can't quite get to 3. So this is where you come in and you start modifying the user counts to force a scale out, right? So once we get to 35, there's my 3 hosts. So the named user is like a good starting point, but using it less as actual users, more as a mechanism to get the exact design size you would like is where you should approach this. So we can ignore this, but as you know, if you're presenting this from a sales standpoint, you need to be aware that maybe you hide this information and you tell them this is why we build it 10 users per hosts. Now, as mentioned, we can scale, and that's what this is here. But if you want to keep them on 24/7, you can come in and lock all 3 of them in. So currently it's 880, 76 with this scaling. If I do 3 reserved, you'll notice it locks 3 instances in and drops it down to 609. Now, even though it's a 63% savings, scaling is still the much more cost-effective way, right? General hosts being on for 350 hours is where kind of a reserved instance makes sense. But at 220, we're almost shaving 130 hours per virtual machine off the top. Additionally, you give up your margin, right? You can still get incentives and rebates if you have your solution destinations for Azure infrastructure. But if you do a reserved instance, the entirety of this 609 is 0% margin in CSP. Right. So you need to be aware of that as you're locking these in. This is, again, where tools, and I swear I'm not sponsored by these guys, but Nerdio Manager for MSP allows you to still capture the margin while driving costs down, giving you the opportunity to either maybe bill more for services. Because if you're doing a comparison of what is in here, the Azure pricing calculator versus someone that is able to scale it more aggressively and efficiently, they can charge more, right? They can just match your price, but make more money. So moving down, the way this storage or managed disk section functions is it's going to treat it like how many operating system disks. And similar to the first video where I put a premium disk as the OS drive, we're going to want to do that here. The major difference now is because we're in a domain controller environment, we're now able to leverage FS logics. And the benefits of that is user profile disks are not on the C drive now. So we don't need to balloon these disks out. Think as these 128 disks as purely operating systems and baseline applications. Data is stored on the app server, profile disks are stored on the FS logics. This allows you to keep your costing down on disk sizes, which is nice. It also allows your golden image, which you will be leveraging in this, unlike the other one, to be much smaller as well. And that golden image is going to be used to re-image these and scale these out. This is beneficial, especially for accounting firms that maybe hire seasonal employees. Maybe they only start with 1 host in the off season and can burst up to 4 or 5. That golden image is going to be crucial for that. And we're now able to leverage this technology using a domain controller environment. Now, speaking of FS Logic profile space, this is where you can establish this. Now, you can also do an Azure file share on premium storage as an individual item and tag it FS Logics. But the one thing that the AVD line item does quite well is it does try to encapsulate everything you would need for that host pool. So given that you always, and I'm going to stop there, always want to do profile disks on premium file storage. Don't worry about what any of the documentation says or what the extra couple of dollars you think you're going to save. User experience is horrendous unless it is on premium file storage. And even if it is tolerable, the costs are insane. Transaction charges are a thing, and they are slammed when they are in a transaction optimized hot or cool, right? The reason for this is just think of what a user profile disk is. It's your C user app data, it's your registry files. just going to Google or Edge and Chrome, the cache that gets created with that is insane. It's actioned every second, and every one of those is a storage transaction fee. You can't upgrade from a transaction to a premium, right? Start with premium. The biggest caveat is you have to predict your size and keep an eye on that, because unlike the storage or the V1 storage, the transaction optimized and such, where that grows as data enters, this is a fixed amount of storage. Now, the minimum is, in this case, 100 gigs. That is the minimum for any premium file storage. I like to do 20 gigs per user because despite trying to clean things up, people love to hoard, right? OST files are massive. So in this case, for 25 users, I'm going to do 500 gigs of storage. Now, this is your opportunity to start caching things down by maybe doing 60 days of caching for OST files, as well as just general cleanup on profiles. You can use OneDrive files on demand, so you can clean up desktop documents and pictures and create Intune policies around ensuring that it always, cleans things up and puts them into an online-only state. This can help reduce this, but your floor is 100 gigs. Now, the last item would be the bandwidth. Now, we did account for that above is its own individual line item. So in this case, I'll go and edit that accordingly. But you can also do it here as well. And that is our AVD line item. So I like to sort things around, and I'll put those with the rest of the infrastructure. Now, what we're looking at in this case is we have a little bit more robust environment. We likely have maybe documents or scanners in play. So we likely want to add a VPN into the environment. So this is where I'll come in and add a VPN gateway. Now, you have opportunities here, and if you use a line of business virtual appliance like a Sophos, a FortiGate, whatever the case is, you can opt to not use the app gateway and the VPN gateway and just rely on that appliance. And most of them will have deployments within Azure with recommendations and specs. And quite honestly, it can be more cost effective to do that as well as keeping it within your realm of control, right? If you're familiar with a firewall brand of your choice, you don't have to relearn something in Azure. You just deploy the VMX, and then you're able to interconnect the site-to-site VPNs and work from there. But keeping it in an agnostic term, we're going to want to come in and choose the VPN gateway AZ1. And the reason for the AZ1 is the general gateway SKUs will be retired shortly, and we'll be forced into an AZ1 anyways. And then we're going to choose our 744. Now, they're going to be much more cost heavy, but understand this is a 650 megabit tunnel, supports more modern authentication methods, especially if you start doing point to site, which you may want to consider. But if you do want to do a basic VPN tunnel, this is 100 megabits per second, supports site to sites in an SSL or an IKEv2 capacity. But you cannot upgrade this one. If you need to move to a higher tier, you'd have to rebuild anyways. So for sake of just set it and forget it type situations, we're going to choose the Gateway AZ1. And the last thing I like to do to account is IP addresses. Because we are now going to be doing a VPN gateway, you're going to get a static IP address with this. So we'll add one IP address. It's very small in cost, but it's good to account for. Now our bandwidth, we're going to just toggle slightly to 250. So that's 10 gigs per user, right? Again, likely not to be actioned, but still good. And then we're going to modify our backups because we've changed both the quantity of VMs we have and the quantity of data. Now, I'm not going to back up virtual desktop, but I am going to create a second backup item for the Azure files, right? The Azure virtual desktops, they are considered ephemeral. There is nothing there. They are, it's got your application data, but they're pulling off the golden image. So as long as your golden image is present, you can blow that up and rebuild within 20 minutes in all settings. And then this is where you add on your automations and such. So we're going to protect our domain controller and our app server. So we change our VMs to 2, and then it's going to multiply the data. So now in this case, it's 700 gigs of data. So if I figure the domain controller and the file server OS disk is 256, and then we threw on a 512 disk, we're kind of in the realm of 750. So I will say about 375. We just want to ballpark it at this point. That'll be the Azure backups. And I'm going to put this label this as VMs now. And then I'm going to double that up. We'll move the second SKU to the right under there. And then we're going to name this one FS Logics. We can even call it profiles, whatever the case would be. We're going to change this to Azure Files, one storage account for 500 gigs. We'll do generic backups. We'll set our performance tier to premium, right? We'll say low data churn because even though it is highly transactional workloads, the reality is this is an enterprise, right? It's still likely going to be very low churn. And then we can do some zone redundant storage, and that will cover this. Now, one item to note on the FS Logic side of things, you may or may not actually care to back this up, right? When we talk profiles, it's kind of end user experience. But if you're using OneDrive and you're backing up OneDrive with like a third party line of business application, in the event a profile is purged, they would just create a brand new profile and then log back in. Some individualized settings may be lost, right? If they have a custom desktop background or whatever the case. But the concept or the idea would be is you could just log back in, log into your Microsoft services, and it pulls down your settings as you need to. So, everything's cached in the cloud at this point. So that is an opportunity there to potentially keep some costing down. Now, in the end, this is a fairly robust build, right? Depending on your client usage, but you have the abilities to modify this to really fit your needs, right? If your app server requires more data, maybe you create a second disk by cloning this one out and you modify. Maybe you do files on standard storage and your database stuff on premium, right? Maybe you tweak that disk size or your disk version to premium SSDs as needed, right? You have the ability to do that, but this will act as a pretty robust template. Now, the only additional thing you got to bring to the table on this one is you have to buy Windows Server licensing for this app server. So that's going to be on a 1 or a 3-year subscription, or if anyone has data center with software assurance, which for a company size like this might not happen. But your local CSP, so Pax8, we can provide it. Again, 1 or 3 year with different payment terms. I generally recommend buying it up front. The ROI on a server like this is usually by month 3. Buying the license outright saves you money by month 3 on a 36-month term, which is substantial. So with this in mind, we'll come in, we'll save this, and this will now be a second estimate build. I will again link this in the chat for easy access, rather in the comments. And if you have any questions about this, if you want to see modifications or have a design scenario, again, please let me know. And with that, we'll catch you next time.